Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon at this Spire Solicitors webinar all about the new model shared ownership lease. It's lovely to see so many familiar names in the participant list, and just such a shame we can't be doing this in real life. For those who don't know me, I'm Estelle Corner. I'm head of the social housing team here at Spire Solicitors, and I'm joined today by Catherine Chatters, who's an associate in the team, and the rest of the team, Sally and Claire and Sophie, are in the audience. Charlotte is hosting the webinar today, so if you've got any queries or problems, if you put those in the chat box and Charlotte will get back to you. We are recording the webinar, so if you miss anything, we will send out the recording later. Now, I can talk for hours and hours about shared ownership, about the policy and the controversies and the detail, but today we are just going to focus on some detail, and that is the detail of the new model lease, which was published by Homes England at the end of May. At the end of this webinar, I'm kind of hoping you'll be a bit more confident knowing your way around the new model lease, and you'll know where to find the new provisions and what they do. And you may also have a checklist of policy issues that you need to go back and think about with your organisation. So first of all, I'm going to take an overview of the new model and have a look at the new fundamental clauses. We'll then focus in on the 1% staircasing schedule, then another focus on the initial repair period schedule. Kat's then going to talk to us about the new key information documents, and finally we'll think about what happens next and your policy considerations, and right at the end we'll do a Q&A. There should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, so if you pop your questions in there as we go along, as I say, we'll look at those at the end. I'm also going to be setting some polls, some quizzes as we go along to try and keep you awake. And this is the first one up on your screen now. This is kind of to test your knowledge, because I am assuming a fair bit of background knowledge here, given the audience. So what is the lease term in new model shared ownership? Is it 250 years, 990 years, or 999 years? I'll give you a few seconds to vote on that. I don't know if we can get the results up now. Ah, excellent. Most of you got that right. It is a bit of an odd one, because 999 years is the sort of the default long-term lease in the property world, but the government have gone for 990 years here on new model shared ownership, and that ties in with their new lease extension policy and the legislation that will be coming shortly. So go look first at overview of the changes to the new model lease. So Homes England have published a new model flat lease and a new model house lease, and these are both available via the Capital Funding Guide. They have said that an OPSO lease and protected areas lease will follow. To avoid undue confusion in this talk, I'm going to focus on the house lease, and really in East Anglia that is the one we are most familiar with. You'll see this later, but I've put together a table in the notes of where you can find the equivalent changes between the house lease and the flat lease. The headline really is not that much has changed. The new policy points have been introduced. We've got two new schedules for the big ones, the 1% staircasing and the repairs. There have been a few stylistic changes. We've now got definitions at the front, for example, but the drafting is basically the same as before. There has been no major redraft. I mean, this is not a plain English overhaul. One thing you'll see in the new model lease, the fundamental clauses are highlighted in blue, which is really helpful. But you also have to remember that the fundamental clauses also include any linked definitions or any consequential amendments to other clauses. And even though these areas aren't highlighted blue, you still can't change them without Homes England consent. So up on the screen now should be this table I was talking about, which is an overview of the changes and the comparison where you can find them house lease versus flat lease. Now, some of the big policy changes didn't require any changes to the drafting. For example, 990-year term, you just put the term in the particulars as before. Initial percentage share from 10%. Again, you just put the share being acquired in the particulars as before. Standard staircasing is now from 5% instead of 10%, and this is just a minor change to the definition of portioned percentage. Otherwise, that standard staircasing schedule has not changed. The nomination period on resales is now 4 weeks instead of 8 weeks, and again, that's just a minor change, just changing 8 weeks to 4 weeks where that appears in the assignment clauses. There's a couple of new fundamental clauses, which is a bit of a sop to lenders, I think, here. There's a clause that says you have to give a lender notice if you intend to take forfeiture proceedings. That clause has always been in the model lease, but is now a fundamental clause, whereas it wasn't before. Also in the house lease, there's some fundamental wording to go in your transfer when people staircase to 100% to do with rent charges and excluding some of your remedies for rent charges. Rent charge is a special type of service charge provision, and it is a particular hot topic for lenders at the moment. We'll talk about the initial repair period and staircasing schedules next. Some other more minor points to note: the key information document for shared owners, which used to be at the back of the lease, that's gone. But instead we've got some new key information documents, which Catherine will tell us about later. Service charge provisions have been beefed up in the house lease, a new clause 7, and also amended in the flat lease, but these aren't fundamental clauses, so you can change them without Homes England consent. On insured risks, you now have to have due regard to UK finance requirements when you have your insured risks on your buildings insurance policy. Interestingly, there's now a restriction on title in the house lease. This has always been in the flat lease, so this is a restriction that goes on to the shared owner's title, where they have to get your consent to register an assignment. Again, this isn't a prescribed clause, a fundamental clause in the house lease, but there is some suggestion in the guidance that perhaps it should have been. And then just a minor one here to know about, the SDLT certificate wording has changed in the leases. There's now 2 options for your shared owners to choose from as suits their circumstances. So focusing in on 1% staircasing, I mean, this really was one of the cornerstones of the government's policy, all about making it easier and cheaper for people for shared owners to acquire shares in their home and I suppose ultimately staircase. These new provisions are in a bolt-on schedule, which is Schedule 7 in the house lease and Schedule 9 in the flat lease. The basic principle, I think we're all familiar with, 1% per year staircasing for 15 years. This works alongside and in addition to standard staircasing. It's very important to note that this 15-year period starts afresh for each new owner. So if your first owner sells on after 20 years, the new owner will get a fresh 15-year period from the date that new owner acquires the lease. The value of the 1% share is calculated using the increase or decrease in the house price index published by the Land Registry. The level of data you're looking for in this is local authority area and house type. There are 4 house types to choose from: detached, semi-detached, terrace, flat, maisonette, and you have to put the appropriate house type in your lease. Up on the screen now, or shortly, yeah, there you go, you've got a link there to the Land Registry data tool, which has all of this information. You can play around with it. And I've also got a representation of the data up there, just terraced houses in South Norfolk by way of example. One of the criticisms of the HPI index is that it's a pretty blunt instrument. There can be variations within local authority areas, and the house type classifications are quite broad. As sort of result of this, either the landlord or the shared owner may request an RICS valuation at their own cost if they aren't happy with the HPI calculation of value. But it's important to note, if you do have that valuation, you don't just take 1% of it to get to the value of the 1% share. Instead, you feed that into the calculation in the lease. So the calculation is basically 1% of base value times new HPI divided by old HPI. And the base value will, by default, be the initial market value, or if you have had a subsequent RICS valuation, it will be the value in there. I think this does get complicated and it might not work exactly how everyone intended it in every circumstance. And it may be that some of this drafting is reviewed by Homes England. So what are your obligations in relation to 1% staircase? And if we go to the next slide, you'll see here paragraph 4.1 of the schedule. You have to serve an additional percentage value notice prior to each review date during this 1% staircasing period. The good news is the review date is the same as your rent review date, so you can serve the staircasing notice and your rent review notice at the same time. That value notice is valid for 3 months from the date of service, but the shared owner can request a new value notice at any time outside that 3-month period. And you'll see at paragraph 4.3, if they do request such a notice, you have to serve it within 14 days. Interestingly, that 14 days is in square brackets, so we do need some clarification from Homes England as to what they were actually thinking there. And moving on to the next slide. There's some more obligations, timed obligations on you at paragraph 5.3. And this is where the leaseholder requests an RICS valuation. Where they do that, again, you have to act within 14 days of receipt, and you have to notify them of the value, the new value, within 7 days of the valuation. Moving on to the next slide. If the shared owner decides they do want their 1%, they simply pay you the value that was in the value notice, the agreed value notice, and at the same time you can require them to pay any arrears of rent. It's then a case for staircasing memo and recalculating the rent in the usual way as you would for standard shared ownership, standard staircasing, sorry. There are no fees involved in this. Remember, no admin fees at all. And that is set out in paragraph 8, I believe. If we go on to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, paragraph 8. Each party is to pay their own costs in relation to staircasing. The only difference here is if a party requests a valuation, the party who requests it has to pay for that valuation. Final staircasing, you'll see at paragraph 7. In theory, you can final staircase with 1% staircasing. Seems quite unlikely, but in theory it's there, although there is a bit of a drafting error here in the lease, I believe, because the definition of final staircasing only allows for final staircasing by portioned percentage, and a portioned percentage is your minimum 5% now. That's kind of really a quick summary of the 1% staircasing schedule. As I said at the beginning, it might need some drafting tweaks. Perhaps Homes England will respond to some feedback on that. But overall, it really pretty much does what we were all expecting it to do. A quick poll now, another one before we move on to repairs. Should be up on your screen now. So in the initial repair period, what is the maximum amount per year that a shared owner may claim from a landlord for essential structural works? Is it £1,000, £500 or nothing? Again, I'll give you a few seconds to put your answers in. Are we good to put the results up? Okay, most of you said £500. Now, I've been a bit mean here because this is a trick question and the answer is nothing. And I'll explain why that is the answer as we look at this in a bit more detail. And so this is all about what Homes England are calling the initial repair period. And I think this is the area of government policy on new model shared ownership that has shifted the most over the course of the consultation. And to be fair, that shift has been in favour of the landlord. The initial proposals were really quite wide-ranging and open-ended, and they've now been curtailed and capped. As with the 1% staircasing, they're contained in a bolt-on schedule, which is Schedule 6 in the house and Schedule 9 in the flat lease, and there are consequential amendments to other clauses in the lease. The first thing you need to know is that unlike 1% staircasing, the initial repair period is a straight 10 years. It doesn't restart on resale, but it does end early if your shared owner staircase is to 100%. The second thing you need to know, and I think this has been glossed over in some of the commentary so far, is that there are two categories of repair and each category is treated quite differently. So the first category is external and structural repair, and here the landlord is responsible directly for procuring those works. The second category is general and maintenance, and this is where the £500 per year contribution comes into play. So up on screen now, I've got a definition from the lease of external and structural repair. So that's from the house lease, and down in the corner is the slightly different part of the definition from the flat lease. It's not great, to be honest. I think we would have all appreciated a little bit more detail and direction as to the extent of what exactly falls within external and structural repairs. It's also quite subjective in places. What are essential repairs? What are normal general maintenance works, which are excluded from this definition? Also, quite a concern is that the lease is silent on who decides whether or not a repair falls into this category, and is also silent on what happens if the landlord and the shared owner don't agree about whether a repair is covered by this or not. So what are your obligations for external and structural repairs? If we go on to the next slide, these are set out in paragraph 2 of this schedule. So you covenant to provide or procure the provision of these external and structural repairs at no cost to the leaseholder. The shared owner has to report the repairs to you and provide non-monetary assistance. I mean, I think stepping back, the whole idea behind this is probably that these kind of external and structural works, certainly on houses, should really be covered by your NHBC or other new home warranty or by your buildings insurance. And if they are, then that's great, you claim through that, but you just have to remember that you have to meet any excess on those policies. You can't recharge that to your shared owner. The second limb, which is the qualifying general repairs and maintenance works, if we skip on another slide, I've got the definition of that up there. There's a little bit more detail here to help us understand what these repair works are that qualify under this heading. But there is still some subjectivity built in. But at least here, we know who decides. The landlord decides, you decide, acting reasonably, whether these works qualify. But the lease is still silent, as to what happens if you and your shared owner don't agree. You'll also see here the works have to be carried out by an approved service provider. So that could be one of your maintenance team or another approved contractor on your approved contractor list, or a Trustmark approved tradesperson. If we move on to the next slide, your obligations in relation to these general repairs and maintenance works are set out at 5.5.1. You have to consider any claim in a timely manner, make payment within a reasonable period, and notify your decision within a reasonable time frame. Now, there was previously talk of some very strict timetables here, timeframes here for you, for your compliance, 7 days, 14 days, and thankfully, Homes England have rowed back from that position. The contribution is £500 per year, as many of you correctly identified in the poll earlier, but you can have up to £500 rolled over from the previous year. So you also have to notify your shared owner each year of the balance of the monies available to them under this general repairs and maintenance allowance. This is in paragraph 5.5.3. Something very important you need to note here is that a year in this context, you need to inform them at the beginning of each year and following an approved claim. A year is not the same as your rent review year or your 1% staircasing year. It is calculated from the date of the lease, so it's going to be different for each of your shared owners. Moving on to the next slide, just another couple of points to note here. 5.6.1, there's no limit on the number of claims that a leaseholder can make in any 1 year, subject to the value cap, which vexatious claims, organised claims, potential issues you might come across. I mean, standing back and looking at this from a shared owner's perspective for a moment, I don't think this schedule is as helpful as it could have been. There is a lot of criticism around shared ownership and repairs. The idea that now you could own 10% of a house but still be responsible for 100% of the maintenance. I mean, it does go some way, but perhaps isn't exactly what the government promised at the outset. I mean, one just small example of this £500 a year allowance is not index linked. It will still be £500 in 2036. I think there's a lot of scope here for dispute and disagreement. And I think unless Homes England come back with some clearer drafting or some clearer guidance on how this works and what is meant to be covered by it, it really is going to fall to you as providers to make up your own guidance for your shared owners, to write out your own policies for claiming and be clear as to what you regard as being covered by each of these repair categories. And leaving that there with talk of guidance, Catherine's going to talk to us now about the Homes England guidance that you have to provide to shared owners under the new model.
Thanks, Estelle. And hello, everybody. I can't believe there's so many of you here. Well, I would say it's good to see you, but I can't see anybody else's faces, which is a shame. I can just see me and Estelle on there, but yeah, it's good to see you're all here. So as Estelle says, I'm just going to be giving a very brief overview of the new notes for guidance. Used to be at the back of the lease, it's now in 3 separate documents. I've put links there to the 3 separate documents so you can find them quite easily. And actually the documents are quite useful. I think, although lengthy, definitely give them a good read and familiarise yourself with them because they're particularly useful for you and your buyers. So all 3 of these documents must be given to your buyers prior to a reservation and get their confirmation that they've actually received them. It's now, Homes England actually require confirmation from a buyer that they've received these documents. So what we will be doing as well, once a property is reserved and we've received instructions, we will also send them to a buyer's solicitors and get their confirmation that they've been received and forwarded on. So the purpose of the notes is to give a buyer as much information about a particular property and shared ownership in general at an early stage so that they can be sure that it is an appropriate product for them before they reserve the property. So this in turn will save you time, so you're not having to waste time on people that aren't familiar with the product and they should know before they actually reserve. So as I've said, it's important that you get confirmation from your buyers that they've received a copy of these documents prior to reserving the property. And remember, these are just for the new shared ownership lease. You don't have to worry about it for your current schemes, but it might be worth pulling out some of the information and including it within your sales packs now because some of the information is particularly useful. So the first one, which is up on the slide now, is the key information about the home. So this document, you have to actually put the information in. So give as much information as possible, such as property type, cost information, and other information about whether you're going to allow pets or subletting, for example. This is good to give to a buyer as soon as possible. I would suggest putting it with your sales particulars. And if you're using an estate agent, then remind them to give to potential buyers. So this goes before they've had their financial assessment and simply just at the stage where they're interested in a site. So the second document is the summary of costs. So this should be provided after a buyer registers with a Help to Buy agent and after they've gone through a financial assessment, but before they actually formally reserve the property, so before they give you any reservation fees. So the summary covers all the costs the buyer can expect to be paying as an owner of a shared ownership home. This includes rent, service charge, etc. And where a specific figure can't be given, so such as solicitors' fees or bills, it just serves as a useful reminder for buyers that they will have to consider these costs. So I've listed here a lot of the costs that are actually in the document, and you can see there's so many there that need to be considered. And I feel this is particularly useful for first-time buyers. They might not be aware of all the different bills they've got to think about. And also on there, there's future costs for selling your home and future costs when buying more shares. Again, very useful. If you haven't been through the selling process, you might not know what you need to be paying out for. And I do find a lot of sellers don't realise that they need to be including you as landlords as part of the selling process. And of course, you need your fees paying as well, and it might not be something that they've considered. So as I said, this goes very early on in the transaction. So it's not quite clear at this stage what the comeback is if, for any reason, the information you give at the early stage changes perhaps halfway through the transaction. It's not unusual for the building's insurance or service charge to change halfway through. So we are waiting for some clarification from Homes England as to whether there is any comeback if the information does need to change. But it's best just to keep this form up to date throughout the transaction, and if it does change, just make the solicitor aware and the buyer aware. So the final document is a detailed guidance note on shared ownership. So you don't need to fill in any information on this one like you do the other two. It's just generic about shared ownership and the new model lease, not specific to a property or a site. I've found this document to be really useful, and as long as buyers read it, it should give them a good understanding of what shared ownership is, how it works, and what they expect to find in their lease. There are a few contradictions, as Estelle said, so although it should be read alongside the lease, be aware that a few points do differ. Definitions, for example, are slightly different, so we are waiting for clarification from Homes England on a few points. So I've noted on the slide there the different sections the form covers. Now, I could go into detail and talk about each section for hours, but I'm conscious of the time. So it's best I'll leave you to read through, familiarise yourself with the document. And if you do have any queries, just come to us after the webinar and we'll be happy to go through it. Of course, this is new to all of us, so we're learning as we go along as well. So just a quick overview. It covers how shared ownership works, what to expect in the new lease, rent and how a rent review works, other costs and when they become payable. The section on maintaining and living in the home, that's particularly useful, although this is one of the areas where there are a number of contradictions. It will give you information on what the landlord, so you guys, what you would have to be responsible for, what a buyer is responsible for, and what you would expect to find covered under the building warranty. It also covers the new repairs allowance and how that works. There's a section on buying more shares, and that covers the new 1% staircasing. And there's also a section on selling your home. So all very useful information. So definitely worth a read and familiarise yourself with that document. So this document does reiterate a couple of points Estelle picked up earlier, which you must remember to do. And I've noted them on the next slide, just as a little reminder. So you are expected to be providing buyers with details of any of your internal policies, such as snagging, your handover policies. And one policy in particular we've mentioned in the note is the lease extension policy, which is a bit of a nonsense really, because buyers shouldn't be worrying about that now for at least 900 years. So I wouldn't get bogged down with that one, but your other policies you do need to be considering. You must remember to be giving the buyers an annual statement of their remaining repairs allowance. Remind them annually about their opportunity to staircase by 1%, and alongside this, give the valuation of the property based on the house price index. And by doing this, buyers have all the information to hand, and so that they can consider whether they really can staircase or not, which I think is quite useful. But as Estelle said, it's going to be key that you are on top of your bookkeeping and organisation as to when you send these updates, because every single update has to be given at a different time and different times for different leaseholders. So you will find organisation is key on that one, because it can get a bit confusing. I feel at this very early stage, we are going to start seeing more and more inquiries coming through from potentially confused buyers, solicitors about the new model lease and about these notes. I'm finding already that solicitors are asking on current sites whether we are using the new model lease, and this is simply due to a lack of understanding. Buyers, solicitors don't necessarily know when the new lease is going to be used, why it needs to be used, and what the changes actually are. And it's completely understandable. Unless you specialise in shared ownership, it's going to take a while to become familiar with the new terms, and Estelle and I, we've read the lease back to front hundreds of times already, so nobody else is going to be doing that. So we do have to be a little bit patient with the buyer solicitors. But I think as providers, it's really important for you to be giving your buyers as much information as possible and refer them to these notes. When you start looking through it, you'll realise actually it's got a lot of information in there, and it's best just to refer them back to that if you're unsure as well, or refer to us, rather than just rely on their solicitors giving the correct information. And talking about potential confusion, and as a bit of a side note, we have had solicitors on previous occasions ask for the model lease to be used when they're extending their lease or buying extra shares or selling. For example, someone very recently wanted to extend their lease, which is no problem, it can be done. And we'd usually do a deed of variation and amend the lease term. But on this particular matter, the buyer was adamant that the new model lease should be used. So scrap the old one that they've already used and change it completely for the new one. So we fought our ground on that one, and we didn't agree to it because we didn't think it was necessary. But there is a guidance note from Homes England that does suggest that scrapping quite old leases and replacing them with the new model lease when someone wants to staircase or extend their lease, it might become good practice. What you would have to do there is remove the new schedules that don't apply, for example, the 1% staircasing or repairs allowance. But I'm not too sure that's actually what they want, because I feel that's going to confuse matters. But what you might find in the short term is, because of this new guidance note, buyers, solicitors are reading it, you might find that your tenants are asking you to use this new model lease when they vary their term or when they buy more shares. So it might be worth considering putting together a policy as to whether you're actually going to do that going forward, or whether you'll stick with the old one and do a deed of variation. But that is a really quick overview of the keynotes, and I would really highly recommend reading through it, familiarising yourself with the content, and I think you'll find the information is quite useful, apart from the few contradictions, which will hopefully be clarified soon. It's definitely well worth a read. And just to remind you, you must provide all 3 of these documents to the buyers and get their confirmation that they've received it. Whether they read it or not, that's not your problem. You've just got to get confirmation that they've actually received it from you. I'll now hand back to Estelle, who will discuss next steps.
Thanks for that, Catherine. As Kat touched on a lot of the policy issues there, the sort of things you need to be thinking about now, and there's a sort of non-exhaustive list up on the screen. The one thing to remember is that even if you don't really have an appetite for new model shared ownership and you aren't going to actively seek it out, it could potentially come in through right to shared ownership. So if you have any rented units under the new government funding scheme, those rented units will be subject to right to shared ownership, and that will be on new model shared ownership terms. And as Catherine said as well, you need to be thinking in terms of your existing portfolio and sales that are going through now or in the future as normal shared ownership, and whether you are going to do things like be a bit ahead of the game and offer 990-year lease terms as standard, whether or not it's new model shared ownership. And although a lease extension policy for people with a 999-year term lease is a bit daft, you do need to be looking again at your lease extension policy for existing shared owners, what length extension you're going to offer and what will the valuation terms be for that. As Catherine said, if people start asking for their old leases to be varied, what is your policy going to be? And you also need to be thinking, as we've sort of said, about your sales policies, your repairs policy, your staircasing policy, this kind of thing, your assignments, subletting and lodgers policy. Homes England has given some more guidance in the guidance notes that Catherine was talking about and in the capital funding guide about subletting and lodgers. There is a lot of confusion about shared ownership. It's not easy. It's not an easy topic at all. And new model shared ownership makes it even more confusing. So I think it is very much going to be on you as the providers to bring some clarity for your shared owners and potential shared owners, and to help them navigate through this very tricky area. So there is an awful lot to be thinking about. And on that note, Q&A. I've got a few questions in the Q&A. Please, if you've got any others, please do type them in. Good question here. When will housing associations have to use the new model shared ownership lease? So it is going to be a condition of grant funding under the new Homes England grant funding scheme, which runs from 2021 to 2026. So if your home, shared ownership home, has been funded under that scheme, new model shared ownership will apply. It is also going to come in through Section 106 schemes, and there is a transition period for that to start being introduced. You're going to start seeing that coming through in your Section 106 planning obligations. Kat, one for you here.
From Joss?
From Joss, yes. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So you want confirmation that they've actually received it, but the notes don't specify that they have to have read and understood the notes. So luckily the burden isn't too high on you, because they might not understand it. They might want further clarification, but as long as you've actually sent them the documents, got confirmation that they've received them, that's good enough for you.
Okay. Interesting question from Martin asked about the Section 106s and new model shared ownership and first homes. And yeah, I think I kind of have to agree with what you said there, Martin. There is this real risk that first homes is going to kill shared ownership dead. If first homes take up 25% of affordable housing on Section 106 schemes, how much space and appetite is there going to be for new model shared ownership? And being very cynical here, why are we going to all this trouble with this new scheme and getting our heads around it if it's going to have its feet cut off by first homes? I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how that pans out and how everyone reacts to it. What else have we got? Can housing associations adopt the new model shared ownership voluntarily? Homes England guidance is yes, you can. I'm not sure why you would adopt it wholesale, but you could adopt it and chop off those bolt-on schedules, the 1% staircasing and the repairs and maintenance. But then I suppose you're going to have to be able to explain that in a kind of buyer-friendly way as to why you are doing that. But yes, Homes England has said you can do it voluntarily. What else have we got? From Kay, is the inclusion of external and structural repair works in the new lease intended to cover any future fire safety, cladding, remedial works if they arise? I think this is obviously far more of an issue on flat leases, and my feeling is that part of this whole repair and maintenance schedule was to do with answering those concerns, because we have seen in the media that this has become a huge problem for shared owners, and the cladding risk has been conflated with shared ownership, which makes shared ownership look bad, whereas in fact it is more of a leasehold risk for flats. And then we end up with a situation where all of this has been applied to houses, and it's not really the same issues with houses. So yes, I think part of the idea was that it was going to address these fire safety and cladding works, but a lot of it again is going to fall down to whether those works come within that definition of external and structural works. They may do, they may not, and then you're still going to have the argument of whether they're going to be covered by your NHBC warranty, or if you developed it yourself, by your arrangement, your contractual arrangement with your builder. I think the answer is still not going to be clear cut for anybody. What else have we got? I think, oh, hang on, am I looking at the wrong bit? I think we've probably answered all the questions in there. Oh, I've one here. Will new model shared ownership apply to OPSO, to older persons shared ownership? Yes, it will, and Homes England have said that they will be publishing a new model shared ownership OPSO lease, which will be interesting because at the moment there isn't a new model OPSO lease. You have to make up your own based on the protected areas lease. So it'd be interesting to see how they apply that and how they apply some of these rules where you've got capped staircasing. I think there were a couple of other questions in the chat. Zara, I think you asked about the staircasing memo. The value notice, sorry. So the 1% staircasing value notice that providers have to serve on tenants who qualify for that every year. The form of that is annexed to the lease. And it's kind of a bit rubbish at the moment. It doesn't give the leaseholder very useful information at all to be able to decide whether or not this 1% staircasing is a good thing for them. And sort of Zara's saying that value notice should really tell you what difference that would make to the rent you pay, as well as telling you how much it would cost you to staircase by 1%, also tell you what difference that would make in your outgoings. And I think that would be a really good idea. And perhaps that's something providers would do voluntarily, even if it isn't a Homes England grant funding requirement or requirement of that notice in the lease. Not sure I can see any more questions, but I'm sure you've got lots, because we have lots of questions about it as well, and we will be writing to Homes England to ask for clarification on some bits and pointing out some of the drafting errors as well. If any questions occur to you, or of course if there's anything we can do to help you navigate through all of this, please do kind of get in contact with myself or Catherine, and we'll see what we can do to help. I'm going to leave you all with a poll, another quiz question. So this is a bit of a temperature test, and it's something I did on LinkedIn when new model shared ownership was first announced. So now we do know a bit more about the lease and the detail of how these policy changes are going to work. What is your gut reaction to it all? How are you feeling about it? Are you feeling positive, negative, or not really sure? And I'll leave you to vote on that. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope we managed to kind of impart a bit more knowledge about the new model shared ownership lease and give you something to be thinking about. And yeah, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.